Hello, everyone, and welcome to Irenicast, the weekly podcast dedicated to conversations on faith and culture. This week, we have a two-part interview for you with Brandy Daniels. We'll be airing the first part today, and then we will post the second part on Friday as one of our bonus episodes. Brandy Daniels is currently one of the authors at the Women in Theology blog site, and she is also a PhD candidate at Vanderbilt University. And she's going to share a little bit of her story, not only of the work that she's doing right now, but especially just her journey and how she got there, from her beginnings in an evangelical youth group all the way up to her current career in academia. So I'm very excited to share this interview with you. So without any further ado, we'll get right into it. This week we have an interview, like I mentioned at the top of the show, and I want to welcome Brandy to the show. Brandy, how are you?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
Doing very well. This is Brandy Daniels. She has an extensive resume, which is pretty amazing, and we'll have a lot of that information in the show notes for you. But currently, she is a PhD candidate. What's the proper term for that?
Candidate, yeah.
Candidate, okay, at Vanderbilt University, and she has several papers and volumes and chapters and books published, and you're
no books yet.
no full books.
Chapters in books, but
Chapters
no books.
in books. Okay, that's a good clarification. So, and a variety of different subjects. So, Brandy, what would you say is your main focus at this point for your PhD?
Yeah, my work is in the intersections between queer theory and Christian theology, particularly what some call constructive theology. A good hint of feminist theory in there too.
That sounds like a lot, and I feel like obviously our show is no stranger to tackling some of these issues, but I'm sure not with the extent and professionalism that you've already had in your life. So give us just a quick synopsis of what that means.
I mean, I guess I'm really interested in exploring the resources that queer theory can bring to bear to theology, particularly around identity. And I don't just mean, I do mean in terms of like different categories of identity, but just in terms of, theologically speaking, theological anthropology of what does it mean to be a human in light of who God is. And queer theory and feminist theory, through looking at particular areas of identity, such as sexuality, gender, but also race, class, economic status, etc., ability, you can go on and on with that list for good reason, question some of the ways culture in modern times constructs identity in ways that we kind of assume today are givens. But I see in both theory and in theology questioning of that in ways that I think are particularly liberative and helpful for what it means to live in this world. A big area of focus for me is also ethics. So anthropology and ethics are kind of my main areas, and like, how are we to live in light of that? And how does shifting how we kind of think about identity shift how the ways we live in the world? That's really broad, but kind of a general.
No, that's good. And that's hopefully, as we go through this, we'll get into some of the specifics on what that looks like. So one thing I didn't mention at the top of the show, for those of you that are listening, is that Brandy is also a former student in my first official hire as a youth pastor in Southern California. So I know that despite Brandy's extensive resume, this is not a world that she was, I guess, born into.
No, definitely not. Yeah.
Like all of us, Mona and Alan, myself, and then many of you that are listening, Brandy started off in a evangelical, conservative, Pentecostal. Were you always in the Pentecostal church?
AG.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. So Assemblies of God world. So let's start there. So tell us a little bit about growing up and what your church experience was like. Some of maybe the positive and the negative.
Yeah. I mean, it's always a both and, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
And later, one of a key thing that my dissertation critiques is sort of the ways we categorize of like things as separate of, church versus world, gay versus straight, or, good versus bad, of it's all kind of more muddled than that, which is a given, but you'd be surprised that the assumed dichotomies people the dichotomies people assume between those things. Growing up, the church that Jeff and Catherine came to eventually was the church I grew up at. I was there since I was like 5 or 6 years old. Pretty decent sized Assemblies of God church in California. I loved church. I was a pretty nerdy kid. Maybe.
I could vouch for that, but in the best way possible.
Oh.
Like if you ever, I was the youth pastor. I wasn't supposed to get answers from students, but I regularly did from Brandy.
Yeah, I remember at one point you had this and I never won this game, but you had this game where you had, you're trying to figure out, get people to stump you in a theological question.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Yeah. So grew up pretty nerdy and also awkward. And in my family, life was complicated, as whose isn't, but not the closest with my family, and had some issues with my family growing up, struggles with mental illness in my immediate family. And so both school and church, but in different ways, were pivotal for me growing up. And church was especially pivotal for me growing up in terms of ways to combine the sort of social and the sort of academic interests I had and the interest I had in spirituality. So yeah, I loved church growing up.
So pivotal in the sense that you felt like it was somewhat of a refuge from home.
A refuge from home, and was able to give me things that home couldn't for whatever reason, just in terms of social development. And I'm also an only child. So sense of community, things like that. Places, neither of my parents went to college. So, different venues in which to ask questions. And church became a weird place for that. And it's interesting now that I reflect back on it, it wasn't like that. I had this sort of kind of rose-colored lens of church doing that for me eventually. But that was largely when you and Catherine got there. Before that, it was kind of a different sort of ethos of, there was the before you guys era and then the you guys era. But that was, church in the you guys and post you guys era was when I began to kind of that academic side. I began to pursue those questions more.
So what you're saying is it was our fault that you lost your salvation.
Obviously, duh. I mean, I was trying to be nicer about it, but.
So generally you would say up until maybe late high school, college, that church was overwhelmingly a positive place for you.
Yeah, I'd say probably early high school. Yeah. And then, but in early high school, getting more into school and getting more into asking questions or early mid high school. And then my struggles with my family increased quite a bit, partly because, college was now this specter on the horizon of something I might do. But then, I didn't even know if I was going to go to college, and really all I wanted to be in life was a pastor's wife. So that's, oh God, that's so funny.
Okay. So that's good.
Yeah.
That's good. So, I remember, my wife telling me the same thing, is that for a long time, she's like, I just need to marry a pastor. That was what was, encouraged in her if she wanted to be in any kind of ministry capacity. So what were some of the things that started to chip away at that, at you, that started causing you to question things and really start you in the direction that you ended up being in?
Yeah. I mean, I think it was sort of, I'd say two things kind of, well, it was a slippery slope, so to speak. But I think the things that sort of set it into motion were, things started getting harder at home with family life. And so I started struggling with some stuff. I struggled with an eating disorder in high school. So the church had always been my place of refuge. So went to the church to kind of try to deal with that. And again, the timing ended up being quite fortuitous, because I had this sort of dual tension of, on the one hand, the church responded awfully. I went to a pastor, and some of my family was dealing with some stuff that then affected me, and all the messiness of that's complicated of that comes with life and ways we try to deal with life. And but I was struggling with this eating disorder, and I knew it was a problem. I just didn't know how to make it not be a problem. I didn't want to keep not eating, which you would then think, just eat. But quite, obviously you wouldn't think that because your wife and like you guys have the academic knowledge that is a little more nuanced than that. But then I quickly became confronted with the sort of theology behind the sort of particular Pentecostal, name it and claim it. And I went to, and this, this was sort of bubbling up and seeing it in different parts. I'd pray and I'd still like not want to eat. And then of course, not to be sort of like TMI or gross about it, but the response sort of was from the community was, so just eat. You tell someone who's struggling with an eating disorder to just eat, that's a quick ride into bulimia.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then began struggling with that. And it was sort of, name it and claim it wasn't working. I was praying, I was trying. That was supposed to be enough. So then that reflected back on my own spiritual life. And I thought, oh, this means I'm not good enough, and thinking back, like growing up, I think I, accepted Jesus into my heart like 7 times. I've always been an anxious human. So, seeing those anxieties come up more as I'm trying to, develop my identity and figure out who I am and what that means and differentiate from my family and all that, that comes with being like in late adolescence. But I, struggling with this, tried to talk to people in the church about it and went to one of the pastors, bared my soul to this pastor and, crying in their office. And they looked me in the eye and they said, Brandy, you obviously don't have a relationship with God. And that was sort of one of my first like, oh, I know how to call bullshit on this, to put it bluntly. And beginning to kind of question too, what counts, what kind of I wanted in life and what possibilities were out there and whatnot. And, I often say, yeah, Jeff and Catherine sort of set my life on a different course. And I don't know where I would have turned up if not for you guys. Either would have turned up super conservative in a way that I think would have had a lot of more harmful effects than even like the path I did take, or would have, and then like been conservative and purporting this kind of theology that I find quite problematic. Or I would have been like, screw it all and gone a totally different path that I don't know if would have allowed me to sort of work through the kind of questions that sort of were at the heart of, and then that turned into some of the questions I'm working on now. I also don't finish sentences sometimes. Sorry. My brain moves faster than my mouth sometimes and I forget. Don't let it catch up.
Well, it's very kind and it's really cool because we've sort of kept in contact over the years, but mostly through Facebook and kind of at a distance. So it's obviously personally encouraging to know that my wife and I were so helpful for you.
Hugely so. Yeah.
So would you say that moment in the with that pastor was, because you said, you're kind of like, I don't know. So that was more of a moment for you where it was realizing that it was more about, I guess, the theology that was kind of behind that whole system as opposed to necessarily the individual people in it that you felt you needed to start distancing yourself from?
Oh, absolutely. It's that it rendered the system not only inaccurate or incoherent, but also just oppressive. Which I again, like I'd seen like glimmers of in lots of different forms, but that was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back.
So from there, then what? Like how did that kind of motivate you to that next step?
From there, kind of, on the one hand, it like made my interest in religion all the more strong, because I was like, why is this problematic? What are alternatives? Beginning to sort of kind of start asking some of those questions that I'd pursue many years later, but then also unraveling like the vision I had for myself and only beginning to do so then, and that first step of that was, instead of going to a college associated with my denomination at the time, going to Azusa Pacific. When I'm telling like shorter versions of the story, I'll tell people, I'll say, oh, my Christian college may be liberal. And again, liberal is also complex and nuanced, and that means a bunch of different things, but shorthand version. Yeah. and people will automatically think, especially in the kind of circles I run in now, they'll think, oh, because you realized how like messed up it was and you pushed back against it. Yeah, there were some aspects of that, but the Bible and theology department, like it's fascinating that APU's sort of Bible and theology department is all from like Claremont, basically, which is not seen as a evangelical or conservative institution in the same kind of ways at all. And I think, the faculty I worked with there definitely had some very much evangelical commitments in particular ways, some of which I don't agree with any longer and some of which I very much still do. But they, also had the commitments of religion scholars and a sort of, questioning one's faith and the sort of building blocks on which it's built actually makes it or can make it stronger. And that this is the work of, faith-seeking understanding. Anselm, I think, right? I'm bad on my patristic history. But that work, that is the work of like scholarship in religion. And to do that means to question. One of the books that was a huge turning point for me, it was in Bill Yarkin's History of Biblical Interpretation class. And it was like a book called like Taking the Bible Seriously. And it was sort of saying, it was like one sort of more conservative reader of the text. It was like, I don't remember the details of the book, but it was a guy saying like, you can't take it literally in order to take it seriously. And kind of going through like the history of biblical interpretation and what that looked like in different points. And that book was huge for me in terms of like, oh, I can still, because at that point it was more of a like not wanting to let go of this thing that had shaped me in negative ways, but also in really positive ways. And, feeling like losing my faith or abandoning my faith or all of that, that's something that's hard. Yeah. Like, riffing off of the title of Sarah Santilli's wonderful memoir, which admittedly a bit of a silly title, but a great memoir overall, Breaking Up with God. That's what it felt like and then having to sort of construct a new framework for who God is and what it means to live in light of what I thought about that. And that was scary and a hard process, but like through their faith and their teachings about faith and nuanced understandings about faith, like the faculty made me liberal inadvertently.
Well,
that makes any sense.
No, it makes total sense. I would say that the same thing was, happened for us. I mean, that school was pretty pivotal for us as far as sending us down, obviously a different road, but in some ways, a similar road.
Absolutely.
So I just want to be able to paint a picture because I think this is important to get to know you a little bit more. Is you're in this process of going to college, you're kind of deconstructing your whole world. You're dealing with some pretty deep issues with family, personal, all that kind of stuff, and you were also triple majoring, correct?
Yeah, I was.
So in 4 and correct me if I'm wrong, you did it in the regular 4 years. You graduated with 3 bachelors.
2 bachelor's degrees.
Two
one
bachelor's
double
degrees.
major. Yeah, because you can't. So one of the things that was interesting when I was going to college, it was between like when I started to think, oh gosh, I'm not going to go to my denomination school. The 2 schools I was looking at were, APU and then Gordon College in Massachusetts, because I always wanted to live on the East Coast. Took me 10 more years, but I made it. And I, part of the reason I wanted to go to Gordon was because they allowed people to triple major. APU didn't, but then I found my way around it. You could double major. So I actually have 2 bachelor's degrees from APU, and one of them's a double major.
Wow. So I think that's important because this is how driven and I remember, and I'm sure that, if I don't want to impose too much of how I remember you from before on who you are now, but you were so driven. Like when you wanted to know something, you were going to figure it out. I think that's an important thing for people to hear at this point is that you were going through all these things, which from a lot of people would just be so devastating and all that other stuff would slip. But I think in the midst of that, it's real encouraging to me to know that you were still doing this really difficult work that I think a lot of people throw to the wayside because it's easier just to say, forget this whole system, forget all of this. But just, I don't know, just the endurance that you had to work through that in the midst of everything else that was going is really really cool to hear. And I think is very indicative of the personality that you've displayed since I've known you.
Yeah. And, definitely a personality quirk, if you will, of like, I like to learn, another throwback to APU, the whole strengths quest thing. I remember like my top one was, this is the only one I remember, was input, like likes acquiring information. I was like, yep, that's me, of, finding just knowledge to be, and later this got confused or got muddled in terms of work I've done on the way of Michel Foucault's stuff, on the way knowledge is kind of automatically connected with power in ways that form us in ways that are sometimes problematic. And so knowledge, I don't think knowledge is power. I think it's a bit more complicated than that. But knowledge and learning has always been sort of an anchor. And there were definitely like bumps in it was like, that was one of the things I had to hold on to as like, I thought my world was falling apart. I was like, well, damn it, I'm getting a degree. 2 of them. I think part of that impulse, especially early on, but still, and in a different way, and less so as I continue on in the life I'm building for myself or whatever, my work, I think in the early stages too of, I still had some of that internal both internal and the social things of like I felt like a lot of people in the pre-Jeff and Catherine era of the church, I felt, it was my sort of social haven, but I felt kind of like the outsider in terms of a lot of the other people's families like were great, and part of that, it took me a while to see, oh yeah, that's how they presented themselves. That's how my family presented itself in a lot of ways. But I felt like the outsider in that I didn't have it together in the same ways as other people, or wasn't good or smart or whatever as other people. And I think part of it, one of the things was school was a place I latched onto of like, I'm going to prove, especially when I started struggling and seeing the way some folks in the church responded to that, it was sort of like a sort of needing to prove myself and maybe doing it in a method that they wouldn't even find valid anyways. And that was the ironic point of like, I'm going to do this to prove myself to you guys. Oh, this taught me I don't need to prove myself to you guys at all. But yeah, that sort of impulse towards, yeah.
So after you finish your, technically you're double major, but officially you're triple major. So what kind of motivated you from there? Like why not just stop and figure out what to do next? And did you have a place at that point where you started to form what you wanted to do with your life, or were you just still pretty motivated for school?
Yes. Part of it is, and I was still sort of, I think embracing even being like good, whatever that means at school, or being a scholar or an academic, is a sort of identity label that I still, less so as time and time goes on, but that I still struggle with, in part because one, it wasn't valued growing up in the church I was a part of, or, neither of my parents went to college. So I didn't know of like, and I think this is super sweet. I was talking to a close family member, on the phone, a month ago. And they were like, so are you going to work in a hospital when you're done? And I was like, I mean, I did a chaplaincy thing for a while, but no, like why? And they're like, well, that's what doctors do. And this family member had no frame of reference for what it meant to get like a PhD, because they never even went to college. So that's been a sort of part of my identity that's been like, oh yeah, this is my world now. And it's not it's not better than a different kind of world, but nor is it worse than a different kind of world. It's just a different world. I do very, very brief tangent. It does drive me crazy. So I get where this impulse is coming from. But when people say like academia is not the real world, I'm like, what kind of world is it then? I live in that world. Like, am I living in this like weird fantasy land that I walk into every time I walk onto a campus? Or I don't know. Yeah. And I get the disconnect between theory and practice and all that stuff, but it's still funny to me.
Yeah. But you could say that about any person's profession. Every profession or path has their own vocabulary, and I mean you can make just an argument that working in the church is not the real world.
Yeah. But then they embrace, a lot of people embrace that one. Church and world are different.
Yeah, well, that's very true.
It's a good thing in that way for a lot of people.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, but in college, I was, taking a lot of classes clearly and realizing I liked it and was kind of good at it. And one of my professors in psychology actually was like, you should keep doing this. And I was like, how? What does that mean? And religion was my primary interest, but I still didn't feel like either smart enough or cool enough to do the religion thing. And this, this isn't a bad thing. And it wasn't only like this. Well, it is a bad thing, but I'm not retroactively reading it as a bad thing. But when I was there, the religion department, the APU was still largely, not entirely, but the boys club. And I wouldn't have seen it as that in that way. But it was sort of like, oh, that's what these smart, cool kids are doing. And I'm kind of neither. I'm on the edges of both, kind of, maybe a little. But psychology, I was like, oh, I got this. And had a close relationship with a professor there who was like, sorry, circling back for a hot minute. But I remember one of the students in theology, one of the sort of golden boys in the program, my undergrad program at the time, people were like, he might go to Duke or Notre Dame. And I remember thinking, that is crazy town. Like, people from here don't go there. I would never be able to go to a place like that, which is now just kind of funny. But yeah, so that was outside of my realm of possibility still. But then this professor was like, oh, you can go to a doctoral program. And then already I was like, whoa, this is crazy. But in psychology. And I ended up applying to programs and got in. And I ended up going to Wheaton College in Chicago. And I went there. It was between Wheaton and Fuller. And I only applied to like Christian programs. One, because that was still my like frame of reference. And two, because I was super interested in both religion and psychology in sort of key ways. And so I thought, I can do both if I do this. And I got into Wheaton and I was like, the Harvard of evangelical schools. Like, I have like, that was my, like, I've reached my peak. I'm not going to get any, like, and still imposter syndrome even there of like, how did they let me into this place? Yeah. And it was funny. So, and I'll get to this in a hot minute, but I ended up not being at Wheaton for very long for very different reasons. But it was super funny when I went there. They make you sign, the like community covenant and like a theology statement, basically. And the theology statement, I signed a community covenant without even thinking about it or looking at it. But the theology statement was, you had to like sign a thing supporting inerrancy. And there were a few other things that I found problematic about it, but I didn't sign it. I wouldn't sign it. And I was in communications with like the director of the graduate school there and thought they weren't going to let me in. And Fuller's only had a infallibility. And I felt okay signing that at that time for whatever reason. But I was like, I can't sign an inerrancy statement. But then they let me in without signing it. And then I find that humorous in hindsight because I ended up getting kicked out of a doctoral program in clinical psychology in Wheaton. I ended up leaving voluntarily, but it's complicated and murky, but I basically ended up getting kicked out for being in a relationship with a woman. So if I would have been as careful in reading that whole community covenant as I would have the theology covenant, I could have probably saved myself some trouble. Yeah.
So how would you identify your sexuality, or what is your gender expression, or where are you with that?
I mean, in terms of gender expression, I identify as a cisgendered female. And enjoy the host of privileges that come with that, which I say, recognizing those privileges. But in terms of sexuality, I identify as queer, which you guys have talked about this some on the show. And I joke and I call myself queer with lesbian tendencies. I've only, I don't think, for a host of theoretical reasons and personal reasons, I don't think sexuality is that stable or that definable in terms of these clear, discrete categories of being. And queer kind of, and sort of some of it's sometimes synonymous with gay, but it's also sometimes synonymous with something or gestures toward something different in terms of like this. I like people, and regardless of their gender expression or identity. So yeah, like, and I say with lesbian tendencies, I've only ever been in love with women, but I'm like, I don't know. Like, I'm not going to like close the box on,
Mm-hmm.
who yeah. And one of my favorite quotes that sort of, I think, kind of encapsulate, there are a lot of quotes, great quotes about queerness and what it is and what it means. But one of my favorite quotes is sort of, he's seen as one of the kind of forefathers of queer theory, Foucault. And he says, "Don't tell me who I am and don't ask me not to change. Leave that to the bureaucrats and the moneymakers. Just spare me their morality when I write."
Nice.
Yeah. But I like that whole, like, it's a sort of kind of his way in the 1970s of saying, don't put me in a box. In part because the box is part of the construct. Yeah, that's a tangent. Never mind.
No, that's totally fine. In fact, just kind of like a question tangent. So in the midst of all this stuff that you're kind of deconstructing, when did that enter into kind of your worldview or your sphere? Like when was the idea of being with a woman? How did that become possible, and what things possible in the sense of your worldview? Like,
Oh, totally.
How
Absolutely.
did that open up the door for you?
Yeah, and that was part of the reason I didn't sign that community, or I didn't question signing that community covenant, is because when the time I got to Wheaton, I was like, oh yeah, like I can sign this. In college, the last year of college, I began like I had a really good friend in college that I ended up falling in love with, and she ended up falling in love with someone else that I introduced her to, oddly enough. So basically I became friends with this group of women who were not all, but there was a group of women who were basically a queer group of women, and some of them had already figured it out, and some of them were figuring it out, that I just kind of happened upon through various connections, and relationships. And but this at the time, and then there was this other girl that was part of that group too, that I like, we were friends, and then like we made out like twice in college, but it was always like, oh, we just crossed the line. We're just really good friends. We just don't know how to express it correctly. And thought nothing of it. I thought a little bit of it, but not, I didn't see, oddly enough, I still don't see sexuality as like an identity, but from a very different sort of way of looking at it than not seeing sexuality as an identity at that point. I didn't think, queer was outside of the realm. I didn't know what queer was at that point, but like gay was outside of the realm of possibility for me still. But then when I got to Wheaton, I made friends with this guy, and we got really close. And I found out later, well, I'm rambling, I'm sorry. From the second week of school, I was sort of already established as in my little cohort as like the feminist, and as one of the more liberal ones. And we're out in front of the Billy Graham Museum having a picnic before our intellectual assessment and psychometrics class with Bob Gregory. And somehow feminism comes up, or something about like women's rights or whatever. And I'm the one sort of not even playing the devil's advocate. It was what I thought, but to them it seemed like the devil's advocate, because they're like, but what about this? I was arguing with pretty much almost everyone else. And it was like friendly banter, and it was fine. But one of the guys in my program who I had already established the kind of friendship with, had hung out with him and his roommate and thought they were like super cool. They lived in Chicago rather than in Wheaton. We're walking up to class after that, and he kind of pulls me back, and he's like asking me, we're talking about feminism a little more. And he says, so what do you think about like homosexuality? And at that point, I still wasn't sure. I was going like back and forth and like dealing with my own struggles or whatnot, and kind of gave him like a sort of middle ground line of like, I'm not sure what I think yet, but I still, regardless of what I think, one, I'm not sure, but the way we're treating people and like is bullshit, and is really messed up. And now we're in the classroom, and Bob Gregory is starting to talk about the Wechsler Intelligence Standard for Children. I remember this moment. It's quite vivid in my head. And, we're kind of in the corner, kind of still talking under our breath. And he goes, I was wondering because I'm gay. And I said, I have no idea. I was like, oh, me too. And that was the first time I said it out loud in any way, shape, or form, and was like, oh, there's that, and it was part of like some sort of Freudian slip, but that ended up being true. And so from there, sort of, this guy was sort of my sort of fairy godmother in a sort of way. And his roommate was actually his partner at the time. And so they kind of like took me under their wing. I was a little baby gay. And I was like figuring stuff out. And that was the first time I felt like safe to actually explore it, and then Wheaton didn't think so. So
apparently not.
Not so much. So Dean and I both apparently one of our colleagues, our classmates, told on us because we had told them. And we both got called into first the dean's office and then the provost's office. And the provost, Stan Jones, is one of the leading experts in the world on reparative therapy.
Oh.
Yeah. Leading researcher on that. And now they're calling it like values something therapy, him and Mark Yarhouse, who's at Regent. And they're calling it something different because they're changing their tune a bit, but not much. But basically what went down is like the options were get kicked out, do reparative therapy with Stan Jones, or leave willingly. And I was I wasn't out to my family. I wasn't out to most of my friends. So I was like, I had actually, when I was in college, a group of like activist kind of type group came to APU my last year, the Soul Force Equality Ride. And they're, trying to change the conversation in colleges, Christian colleges, about gay rights and gay students in their schools and whatnot. And I looked up their info and I sent them a quick email of like, I'm freaking out. I'm about to get kicked out of a program, like a doctoral program. Like, what do I do? And within like hours, I got an email and then a phone call back from the director of that program, Haven Heron. And she was like, leave them, come go on the equality ride with us. And she sort of saw in my like panic of where I was at that point. So I left willingly because I was terrified. And I went on the equality ride as an ally because I was still like, I can't, I don't know, of which, I pretty much came out the whole way at that point, whatever that means. But by the end of the ride, I was no longer an ally. And it was through that weird sort of set of experiences. People on the equality ride came from like a wide variety of, some of them went to like conservative, one of the people on the bus had gone to Bob Jones, or that super conservative, like there were a lot of super conservative schools represented because those were a lot of the schools we went to. But then some people had gone to like Dartmouth or Yale. And I'd started getting in conversations with these folks and was like, and they were like, go to divinity school. And I had never seen that as a possibility. And they were like, no, go to like somewhere like Yale or Duke. So with their sort of guidance, I finally was like, okay, I'll apply. Yeah. And then I applied and got in some places and went to Duke for really weird reasons.
Like what? When you say weird reasons?
When I was visiting, I went to visit Duke in part because I was living on a bus for 2 months. So it was like I could leave, rent a car, travel down. Like we were visiting Montreat, which was in Asheville. So 3-hour drive by myself, a hotel by myself. I was like, yeah, I'll go visit. And so I went and visited Duke. And when I did, they were ending their sort of gay rights, not gay rights, LGBTQ student group, Sacred Worth, riffing off the clause in the United Methodist, Duke is United Methodist thing about all people are of sacred worth. They had just done a series of events and they were doing like a last day event of like kind of talking about what went down and whatnot and, what we think about all this. They had Gene Rogers, who is an amazing scholar who wrote an excellent book, Sex and the Christian Body, Their Way into the Triune God. That was one of the pivotal books for me the day before. And so they were doing a sort of debriefing. And I saw this sign when I was doing the sort of tour of Duke. And it was like, let's come and talk about it. And I was like, oh, this will be interesting. Let's see how Duke handled it. Like, this is what I'm doing for a living right now, going to colleges and talking about these things. Let's see how Duke handles it. And I went, and it was awful. I was like, I'm like at one of the Christian colleges we go to. Some people, there was a guy who was committed to celibacy because he thought it was wrong. And that's fine. Like, if that's his vocation, but because he thought it was wrong, I have huge issues with that for a lot of different reasons. Mm-hmm. And people were like, yeah, and people were debating whether it was a sin. And I'm like, really? We're still there? Like, I'm at Duke and this is the kind of conversations we're having here? And then I went straight from that lunch meeting to the financial aid office to where they tell me, oh, we're not giving you that great of a package here. And I had already known at this point that Yale had given me a full ride and Vanderbilt had given me like 85% or something. I think it was flipped. Yale had given me 85% and Vanderbilt had given me a full ride. And Duke was like, we'll give you nothing. And so I was like, yeah, peace out, you guys. But then appealing to my contrarian activist sensibilities, the only guy in that group who had been saying, well, there were two, but one of the guys in that group who had been saying some pretty cool stuff that I was like, okay, he shows up in the financial aid office and was like, "Can I take you to coffee?" And I was like, "I'll let you buy me a biscotti, but you're not convincing me to come here." And then, of course, he convinced me to go there. And part of it was the sort of, you're still going to learn a lot. This is a good kind of balancing point between your, evangelical world and, wherever the heck you are now. And there was this whole thing. He was like, you'll get bored at a place like Brandy, which I think Duke was really good for me at the time and really pivotal in a lot of ways, and in ways that I didn't expect. Their their program in literature there has some of like the best theorists in the world, and I got to study with some of them.
So would you say your education process, it was important for you to kind of, I don't want to say ease into, but have like a progression of liberalness where you didn't want to go from one extreme to the other, but you felt it was a easing process?
Yeah, absolutely. And and I didn't, hindsight's always 2020, but at that point I thought, oh, I'm not that liberal, but and I still consider my own sort of theology somewhat orthodox, depending on what you mean by that. That's a super loaded word in a lot of ways, and I mean like orthodox, little o. And I'm still sort of orthodox in some key systematic points, but in very different ways than I was then. But I thought, oh, a place like Vanderbilt doesn't take that kind of stuff seriously, which that's humorous now. So it was sort of, it was a stepping stone that I didn't know was going to be a stepping stone. It was just sort of like, that's what I needed at the time. And it was in just ways I didn't expect.
And how many degrees did you end up leaving with?
2 degrees from there.
Okay.
I did my MDiv, Master's in Divinity, and then I ended up staying on for an extra year and did in the graduate school, not in the divinity school, doing a Master's of Arts while I was applying to doctoral programs and such in the humanities and African American studies.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. Duke ended up being a weird place, but a great place in terms of figuring out, what I believed and what I was interested in studying, and had some great faculty there that I worked with, and then decided, oh yeah, I don't want to be here anymore. Yeah.
So to backtrack a little bit, when you left, or voluntarily, or however you want to look at it, when you left Wheaton and you started working with this group, was there a point where you were just like, oh, I found what I'm going to do and I'm going to kind of stay there? Or did you always know kind of in the back of your mind, I need to continue on with school? And I guess as a connection to that, in all that, did you have at any point throughout this process or the entire part of the process, like have a goal? Like, did you know what you wanted to do or where you wanted to end up?
Oh God, no. Just because those were, in terms of that latter question, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I mean, I had kind of thought, I don't know what I was thinking at that time. It was sort of like another one of the like, oh, my life's been like, my plan's been messed with. Crap, what am I going to do now? And sort of, well, here is an option for this, and I left Wheaton after one semester. So I might have been thinking, oh, I'll apply to other psychology programs, or I think school was always a factor in the back of my mind, but I had no idea like how or why or in what. And I certainly didn't think like, oh, Duke. That was still outside of the realm of possibility, but then quickly realized, oh, maybe it's not outside the realm of possibility, because people told me, Brandy, that's not outside the realm of possibility. I needed it pretty like bluntly. People being like, yeah, you're fine. You can go there. Don't not apply because you think you can't. So yeah, I think I had no idea what. I was still young enough in such a way that I wasn't thinking about, oh, what will this mean for my future and jobs and money and all that stuff. I was just sort of like, mind you, now I think about that a lot. Oh God, I'm never going to get a job because the crisis in the humanities is enormous. And yeah. But at that time I was just like, who knows? But I have a semester where I'm not doing anything and I need to do something. And there it was. Yeah.
So before we kind of move on and talk about your next step, were there anything that happened at Duke during your time there that was another pivotal moment as far as your understanding of certain things or interactions with people that kind of further shifted your focus?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was really about, while I'm sure there's some like little vignettes or stories I can give, it was really more about like different relationships or opportunities I had while I was there. One of my first semesters there, I ended up taking a class in the lit department, politics and the humanities. with Robin Wiegman and Michael Hart. But Robin is a significant figure in feminist theory. And Michael Hart is, people are calling him one of the, he co-wrote a trilogy with Antonio Negri, who is an Italian scholar who's in prison for political subversion. And they co-wrote this trilogy called Empire. Well, it's Empire, Commonwealth, and Empire, Multitude, and Commonwealth. But people are calling that trilogy sort of the modern day communist manifesto. So in hindsight, I'm like, oh gosh, he's a huge deal. But at the time I was like, I don't know who these people are. This class sounds interesting. I want to take something outside of the divinity school. So like signing up for that class and realizing, oh, this whole feminist theory thing is pretty awesome. And working with some faculty in the divinity school, J. Cameron Carter and Willie Jennings, as well as a host of some of the feminist faculty there, Mary Fulkerson and Amy Laura Hall, of just sort of them kind of nurturing and fostering my interests in what my interests are in, and kind of reminding me that I was asking good questions and I had good insights and was a good writer. And that and the constantly in different venues and in more nuanced ways coming up against some of the problems that I'd seen in kind of starker form in like the evangelical world about things about identity and what spirituality was and what it meant and how all those things intersect, and was thinking, oh yeah, like I want to pursue this more.
And in the midst of all this, did you still feel like you had, and I know it's hard to nail down exactly, you know, like you said, faith and salvation and all that, they're very weighted words and all that kind of stuff. But in the midst of it, would you still that you had a certain spirituality that was guiding you in a way?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that sense of what that was, especially towards the end of my MDiv in the beginning and during my MA, that sense of what that was shifted pretty dramatically in nuanced ways, but dramatic ways. And then looking back, I'm like, oh, that was a slow, you know, again, I it was all a slippery slope, and starting from APU, you guys coming to that church, and then boom, boom, you know, then one event after the next. I'm like, oh, I'm starting to think kind of differently in all of these key ways. Yeah.
But so even though at times it was maybe fuzzy and unclear, it was still a motivating factor in your kind of movement forward and trying to understand all these different, not only different concepts, but different people groups and personalities and theologies and stuff.
Yeah. And trying to make sense. Yeah. Trying to make sense of it, like of what it means, you know, of spirituality and of faith and what it means to be human in light of all these kind of new questions I was asking and new things I was reading in light of theology, and then what it meant to live in light of that too. Coming back to that sort of anthropology and ethics sort of being my key sort of overarching areas of religion that I kind of focus on.
We're going to go ahead and stop the interview right there, and we will post the rest of it on Friday for our bonus episode. So if you have anything you'd like to add to the conversation for this week, you can comment on the show notes at irenicast.com/28. And there you'll also find informational links on the work that Brandy has been involved in and where you can find some of the stuff that she's written. So that'll do it for us this week. Thank you for joining us. If you like what you hear, you can help support the show by going to iTunes and Stitcher to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. And you can contact us anytime at our feedback page at irenicast.com/feedback. And there you'll find all the ways that you can contact us through social media and all of that. So for this week, I'm Jeff, and thank you for joining the conversation.